Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast. Episode 3.1, Welcome to the Battle of Berlin. Hello, and welcome back. In the first and second series of the Europe at War podcast, we looked at the Halbe Pocket and the Battle of Bautzen. When covering those stories, I outlined how those battles took part within the context of Operation Berlin, e.g., the Soviet Union's final assault on Berlin. And I also made the case that these battles had often been overlooked by historians who, when studying the defeat of Germany in late April and May 1945, seemed to always be focused on the Battle of Berlin and the fighting which raged there. Well, it's also time for me to shift my focus to the Battle of Berlin, as the Red Army's capture of the capital and the downfall of the Nazi regime is really the last major piece of the puzzle to Germany's defeat in 1945. Therefore, this new series will tell the story of the Battle of Berlin, day by day, running from the first appearance of Soviet troops right outside the gates of Berlin on the 20th of April, right through to the surrender of the Berlin garrison on the 2nd of May. Of course, the Battle of Berlin is a more well-known story compared to Halbe or Bautzen, so most people already know the broad strokes of what happened in Berlin. But as always, I will bring the story to life with personal accounts from the commanders, soldiers, and civilians who were caught up in the fighting. For this series, I've deliberately chosen to focus on the time span between the 20th of April and the 2nd of May, as I feel the initial opening phase of Operation Berlin, the Red Army's assault on the Seelow Heights and its crossing of the River Neisse, has been covered in depth by my previous series on Halbe and Bautzen. But before I start telling the story of the battle day by day, I want to spend this first episode outlining the situation facing Berlin and Berliners during the first few months of 1945. Because one of the key themes I will return to many times throughout the series is just how destructive and horrific the battle was for ordinary Berliners. Then I'll move on to outlining the defense strategy and garrison forces hastily assembled for the defense of Berlin. And lastly, I'll finish off with an analysis of the Soviet attack plan for Berlin and the forces which were tasked with capturing the capital. For this new series on the Battle of Berlin, I will take the same approach as I did with my previous series on Bautzen, in that I will also be posting links to maps in the description for each episode. You can then use these maps to better visualize the story, understand the geography of the battle, and keep track of the locations I have referenced to in each episode. And one last thing before we kick off the new series, I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone out there who listens to the show. The podcast is really growing, and I'm always happy to receive feedback or questions from long-time listeners or first-time listeners. Also, regardless of how you listen to the show, whether it's via Spotify, Apple, or whichever service you use, please make sure to hit the follow button so that you don't miss any new episodes. And if you could leave a rating or a review via your podcast platform of choice, then I would really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, that's the housekeeping part taken care of. Time to travel back to Berlin in 1945. There's a famous saying in German which goes, "Du bist verrückt, mein Kind. Du musst nach Berlin." You are crazy, my child. You have to go to Berlin. Well, in the spring of 1945, you really had to be crazy to want to go to Berlin. Because after 6 long years of war, Berlin, once the proud beating heart of the Third Reich, had been reduced to rubble, and the people of Berlin were on their knees. Dresden and Hamburg often feature in most people's minds as the most prominent examples of German cities which were reduced to ruin by successful Allied bombing raids. But actually, it was Berlin which claimed the title of the most bombed city in the Third Reich. Because during the war, the RAF and the US Army Air Force launched more than 450 raids on the city, dropping more than 45,000 tons of bombs in the process. Of course, as the Allied armies advanced through Europe and the flying distances between their air bases and Berlin shortened, the intensity and frequency of those air raids on Berlin only increased towards the end of the war. And from February 1945 onwards, the city was pretty much bombed day and night by the Allied air forces, who by now had broken the back of the Luftwaffe and established air supremacy over Germany. The centre of Berlin, where the government buildings and Nazi leadership were headquartered, had borne the brunt of these attacks, with the central district of Mitte being almost 80% destroyed, and the Tiergarten district almost 50% destroyed by the spring of 1945. But in truth, no corner of the city had remained untouched by Allied bombing. Every time a new bombing raid hit Berlin, large fires broke out in the central districts. However, unlike in Hamburg or Dresden, Berlin was somewhat saved from huge firestorms spreading unchecked around the city, due to the number of large boulevards and wide streets which formed natural fire breaks which helped to contain the worst of the blazes. Nevertheless, this was a small saving grace, and the people of Berlin just wanted the living hell they were going through to be over. To get an idea of just how grim life was like for Berliners in the spring of 1945, here is a quote from Paul von Stiemann, who was a young Danish reporter stationed in Berlin during the war. Dullness, anticipation, fear, and continuous bombing. It was a soulless existence. The war seemed perpetual. The sameness of each successive day was blunting, but the obliteration of all beauty was even more so. The flowers had gone, the books had been burnt, the pictures had been removed. The trees had been broken. There were no birds singing, no dogs barking, no children shrieking. There was no laughter and no giggling. No face ever lit up in a warming smile, no friendly kiss or hug. There was still the sky above, but then it was often effaced by the stinking and greasy carpets of voluminous black smoke. At the start of the war, the population of Berlin had surpassed 4 million, as people flocked to the city from all over Germany, after the Nazis turned the city into the jewel of their newly crowned Third Reich. But by the last months of the war, despite the influx of German refugees from the east and the presence of forced foreign labourers in the city, Berlin's population had fallen to between 2 or 2.5 million people. This fall in population was caused primarily by people who had been redeployed elsewhere in the Reich to take up jobs in arms production and other war-related industries. But of course, another huge reason for the exodus of Berliners was due to the increasing Allied air attacks on the city, with at least 50,000 Berliners dying in bombing raids during the war. As a response to the increased threat to Berlin from the skies, from 1943 onwards, as the air raids had intensified, Goebbels, as Gauleiter of Berlin, had evacuated close to 1 million people from the city. The idea was to reduce the number of useless mouths in case fighting ever reached Berlin. For the Berliners who remained, an intense program of air raid construction was finally implemented, with a mixture of public shelters and private shelters built throughout the city. The public shelters were located usually in U-Bahn stations and tunnels, or within the basements of large, sturdy concrete buildings, whilst a system of more than 100 massive concrete shelters, which had roofs which were 3 feet thick, were also constructed. And these concrete shelters were designed to host hundreds of people at a time. The private shelters, meanwhile, focused on the transformation of cellars within apartment blocks, whereby the cellar exits were reinforced with brick walls and fitted with steel doors. Laura Kessler, a schoolgirl who lived in Pankow in the northeast of Berlin, recalled how her family had turned the cellar under their house into a well-stocked shelter. The ceiling was strengthened with planted tree branches. There were benches, chairs, a covered billiard table for the bags and cases. There was shelving with provisions and bottles of water, and a large metal bathtub full of shimmering water. Furthermore, there was a bucket of sand, gloves, towels, blankets, candles, matches, bandages and gas masks, along with steel helmets and torches with batteries. Outside, on the fence, there was a sign saying air raid shelter. The irony of the city's air raid preparations was that all of the public and private shelters which were built to house the people of Berlin during Allied air raids would also double up as vital shelters for civilians during the eventual Soviet assault on the city in April 1945. In any case, the Allied air raids of early 1945 became so frequent that Berliners felt they spent more time in the shelters than out of them, and the lack of sleep was causing the people of Berlin to become both physically and mentally exhausted. In many ways, Berlin was a city under siege long before the Red Army turned up. The stoicism of Berliners was being put to the test, and the people's long-standing obedience to and fear of the Nazi regime was melting away, as people began to fear Russian vengeance much more than the threats issued to them by the Nazis. Berliners sought refuge in humor, and they joked openly about the desperate situation they were in. For instance, on the doors of every air raid shelter in the city, large initials had been painted. The initials were LSR, meaning Luftschutzraum, or air raid shelter. However, the LSR initials were instead rechristened by the people of Berlin to stand for Lernt schnell Russisch, or Learn Russian Quickly. That said, as long as the direct impact of the war could be constrained to just the threat of Allied bombs, the people of Berlin could find a way to get on with their lives, and their spirit, whilst damaged, remained unbroken. However, once their city found itself on the front line, and all of the horrors, death, and destruction of the war were brought home to the streets of Berlin itself, Berliners would find themselves tested to extraordinary limits. And ultimately, for some, the battle and the subsequent victory of the Red Army would break them completely. With the war having turned so definitively against the Germans, you'll be shocked to hear that the defense plan for Berlin only really started to come into shape in February 1945, when Hitler declared the capital to be a Festungsstadt. And only then was a real concerted effort made to turn the city into an impenetrable fortress which could withstand any Soviet attack. That said, it still took until early March 1945 before the first plans for the defense of the city were actually formulated, when Generalleutnant Helmut Rehmann was appointed to the position of commander of the Berlin defense area. And when the new commander was appointed to his position, he was shocked by what he saw. Almost nothing had been done to prepare Berlin's defenses, and thus, with just over a month to go until the final Soviet onslaught on Berlin, Rehmann faced the impossible task of coming up with an effective defense strategy given the measly amount of troops and resources available to him. The appointment of Rehmann, however, could have been a sign that the Nazi Party leadership was starting to change its mind and realize the threat Berlin was under. But if you think the Nazi leadership was now going to start acting rationally and soberly in preparing the defense of the city, then think again. The truth was, Hitler was still calling the shots, and unlike in our series on Halber or Bautzen, where Hitler could exert very little direct control over the decisions taken on the battlefield by the German generals, In the Battle of Berlin, however, Hitler and other senior Nazis like Goebbels will play a central role in preparing and conducting the defense of the capital, for better or worse. And spoiler alert, it's going to be worse. As soon as Raymond took command, Hitler immediately promised him all of the resources, supplies, ammunition, and frontline men he needed to defend Berlin. This was complete rubbish, of course, because Hitler couldn't just conjure up the manpower and firepower needed out of thin air, given the dire straits the Third Reich was in at the time. In any case, Hitler wasn't just wrong, he was also essentially lying to Raymond, as the Nazi and senior military leadership of the Third Reich never had any intention of ensuring Berlin had the resources to defend itself. The truth was, Berlin was never intended to be on the front line, and a battle was never meant to take place in the city. And so as a result, throughout the spring of 1945, Berlin was continually deprioritized when it came to designating how Germany's meager resources were going to be allocated on the battlefield, with the majority of available manpower and firepower reserved for the front-line units desperately holding back the advance of the Allied armies in the west and the Red Army in the east. Berlin's defense would continue to be overlooked by the German leadership, right up until the Red Army arrived at the city, and by then, it was too late. Nevertheless, when taking command of the Berlin defense area, General Raymond had to do the best he could with what little resources he had, and he soon created a 5-point defense strategy for the outer and inner sections of the capital. The first step of the defense plan called for the establishment of a forward defensive line beyond the eastern outskirts of the city, the direction where the Red Army was expected to attack from. The line would be 80 kilometers long and would use the Dahme and Alter Oder rivers as natural barriers. The second step of the plan was to create a belt of obstacles blocking the major road junctions leading into North and South Berlin. These first two outer defensive measures barely feature in the upcoming fighting at all, however, and it's likely, given the scarcity of resources and the lack of time available, that these defenses were only half-heartedly implemented and were brushed aside by the Red Army with ease. The third step of the defense plan called for the construction of an outer defense ring around Berlin. This outer defense ring would measure 95 kilometers long in total and roughly follow the administrative boundaries of the city. This outer defense ring consisted of a single trench line reinforced with covered positions and command bunkers. To strengthen this trench line even further, obsolete tanks were dug in at certain intervals, and 20 artillery batteries were stationed behind the trench, particularly along the southern and eastern approaches to Berlin. However, given that there was so little time to prepare these defenses, very few concrete reinforced bunkers were completed in time for the Soviet attack, and the ones that had been constructed along the outer defense ring were located on open ground and fields, meaning they were likely to be bypassed easily by enemy tanks. These outer defenses of Berlin were to be manned primarily by inexperienced, underaged, or elderly members of the Volkssturm, armed with the usual mix of Panzerfausts, foreign rifles, and handfuls of grenades. These Volkssturm units were also, quote-unquote, strengthened by Luftwaffe ground crews, who had been hastily converted into frontline infantry, as the Luftwaffe had run out of fuel to fly its planes. The amount of Volkssturm and Luftwaffe personnel who manned these outer defences were laughably short of what was required. And given their lack of experience, these Volkssturm and Luftwaffe units were expected to offer up only a token resistance to the incoming Red Army. This is not a promising start, so let's see what was planned for the defense network within the city of Berlin. The fourth step of the defense plan called for the establishment of an inner defense ring running along the S-Bahn ring train line network within Berlin. This inner defense ring stretched for 48 kilometers in total, and it provided the first substantial defense obstacle. And that was because the S-Bahn ring had several parallel tracks, which sometimes ran through deep grooves in the land, whilst at other points running along steep embankments. And this series of deep grooves and embankments were perfect for defensive measures. So firstly, these embankments could be turned into effective anti-tank ditches or obstacles. And secondly, if Soviet troops tried to advance over these embankments, they would walk straight into a killing ground because the German defenders could position themselves in high buildings within the inner city perimeter and then simply rain fire down upon the enemy as they appeared over the embankments. To fortify the inner defense ring even further, all of the roads leading into Berlin center were barricaded, and these barricades were then covered by anti-tank weapons and 88mm guns, which provided significant opposition to incoming enemy tanks. And last but not least, the fifth and final step of the Berlin defense plan required the establishment of a fortified system of defenses around the center of Berlin itself, protecting the heart of the Nazi regime. And this central part of Berlin, which was located on the island formed by the River Spree and the Landwehr Canal, was called the Citadella, or Citadel. The Citadella district comprised the most important government buildings, and it also contained the Reichstag and the beating heart of Nazism itself, the Führerbunker. Given the importance of the Citadella, it's no surprise that this sector was the best defended of all of the Berlin defense sectors in terms of defenses, troops, and equipment. For example, the defensive positions in the Tiergarten Park and at the Brandenburg Gate were held up as model examples of what the defense of Berlin should look like. Here, multiple rows of trenches had been dug, impressive machine gun nests had been built, numerous heavy guns had been placed, and even Tiger tanks had been dug in to support the most important defensive positions. So that's the formal defense plan for the city laid out, but we should not overlook the fact that the civil and military authorities in Berlin also ordered that every neighborhood, street, and building be turned into a death trap for any invading Red Army forces. For instance, all streets and major road junctions were to be blocked by barricades, and most major buildings were to be transformed into static defensive positions. Barricades were also to be constructed in side streets, allowing passage only to pedestrians, whilst those in the main streets were closed to vehicles at night. Machine gun posts were prepared in cellars and upper stories to cover these barricades, and holes were knocked through the dividing walls and cellars of buildings in order to provide cover to defending troops moving from building to building. The city's U-Bahn and S-Bahn tunnels were also manned at key intervals in order to prevent Soviet infantry from using them to infiltrate into the city centre, whilst plans were also drawn up to flood the tunnels as a last resort, if needed. And lastly, all of Berlin's 483 bridges were wired with explosives. The defense planners created various contingency plans which dictated which bridges should be blown and when. On the one hand, some bridges were planned to be blown first in order to slow down the Soviet advance, whilst other bridges were only to be blown as a last resort. This is likely due to the fact that the military leadership was mindful of the fact that blowing all of the bridges at the same time would frustrate the movement of Berlin's own garrison troops, whilst also trapping the defenders in the city, preventing them from fleeing if needs be. In order to prepare Berlin for the impending battle, a force of 70,000 workers were thrown into the tasks of digging trenches and building the street barricades, which were pivotal to the defense of the city. This workforce, who worked day and night in the weeks leading up to the battle, were drawn primarily from Organisation Tod and Reichsarbeitsdienst personnel, as these organizations were the only ones who possessed the proper tools and know-how for the work. But given the tight time schedule and the enormous task at hand, these workers were also supplemented by soldiers, civilians, forced foreign laborers, and prisoners of war. Given the constant air raids which targeted Berlin non-stop, the transportation of building materials and workers in and around the city was hazardous. Plus, the lack of fuel meant that the heavy materials were unable to be transported by truck or train. Therefore, most workers traveled to their designated construction sites on foot, and the heavy materials were transported by horse-drawn carriages. Given the lack of experienced engineers available, the disruptions caused by Allied bombings, and the desperate lack of equipment such as barbed wire, nails, and anti-tank mines, the quality of the defensive positions which were constructed were wildly inconsistent. And in the upcoming fighting, many of these positions would be easily crushed by Soviet tanks. In the end, the sturdiest and most effective defences were established in the Citadella district, with the quality of the defences dropping sharply the further out from the centre you went. Whilst Berlin was struggling to build these last-minute defences, it could count on some longer-term defences which had been constructed earlier on in the war. And the centrepiece of those longer-term defences were the 3 gigantic flak towers which had been constructed at the Humboldt-Hain Public Park in the north, the city's zoo to the west, and in the Friedrichshain Public Park to the east. These flak towers had been constructed for the defence of Berlin from the air, and they had impressive flak guns stationed atop their towers to shoot down Allied bombers attacking the city. Also, these flak towers could provide shelter to large numbers of civilians and soldiers during the constant Allied air raids. These flak towers really were gigantic, with the largest flak tower at Zoo being over 42 meters high. But it wasn't just the height of these things which was incredible. The walls were at least 2.5 meters thick, with the ceiling being up to 4 meters thick. The Zoo flak tower had 5 floors. The top floor contained the tower barracks of around 100 men. The 4th floor contained a well-staffed and fully equipped hospital, and the 3rd floor contained a storage space which was used to house some of Berlin's most prized artworks. The lower 2 floors were primarily used as air raid shelters, which could provide space for up to 15,000 Berliners at any time. The tower was completely self-contained with its own water and power supplies, and it was well stocked with food and ammunition. With the Red Army nearing Berlin, however, the defensive capabilities of the flak towers were quickly converted for offensive use, with the bristling array of guns lowered so that they could target Soviet tanks. Plus, the impenetrable nature of the buildings themselves made them ideal command HQs for garrison troops during the fighting. Berlin's aerial defences fell within the remit of the Luftwaffe, so these flak towers were manned exclusively by Luftwaffe men. At least that was the plan. With the war going badly and the Berlin garrison plagued by chronic manpower shortages, the operation of the massive flak towers increasingly came to rely on POWs and Luftwaffenhelfer, who were typically 15 or 16-year-old boys and girls who were taken out of school and thrown into the front line of the flak towers. The POWs were forced to carry up shells from the bunkers for the flak guns, whilst the Luftwaffenhelfer assisted the Luftwaffe gunners by performing tasks such as operating searchlights, radar, or communication systems. As the battle later progressed, however, many of the teenaged Luftwaffenhelfer would be called upon to operate the flak guns themselves. One of the Berlin teenagers called up to serve in a flak battery recalled how he felt after his first day serving in one of the city's flak towers. I am a Luftwaffenhelfer, a loader in battery number 1, flak tower section 123. We are all 15 or 16 years old. Only the platoon leader, Corporal Ulrich, is an experienced artilleryman. He takes photos of us for our passes. In the afternoon, the battery commander, Lieutenant Kutner, addresses us, and we receive our uniforms from the quartermaster. In the evening, we swear an oath to the Führer, Adolf Hitler, and to Greater Germany. The swastika flutters in the breeze, and we gaze to the east and swear loyalty until death. The three main flak towers of Berlin were complemented by dozens of smaller towers spread throughout the city, all serving broadly the same purpose as the larger towers, just at a smaller scale. In any case, all of the city's towers were to become important command hubs and defensive positions for Berlin's defenders during the fighting. Another important aspect of a successful defense strategy would be to come up with a coherent and robust communication system which could be utilized by the defending troops in the heat of battle. Berlin did not have this. For instance, the Luftwaffe personnel responsible for the management of the flak towers could rely on their own communication system, but the Volkssturm units had to rely on the civilian telephone network, or runners, for communication. This inevitably led to poor communication between command headquarters and the frontline units fighting throughout the city, and it rendered the effective organization and deployment of those units impossible, as there was no clear picture of how the battle was progressing for the commanders. Confusion would thus reign supreme in the subsequent fighting. The supply system for the garrison troops was likewise hastily organized, and it suffered from a desperate lack of centralization. On the one hand, food stocks throughout the city were adequately prepared in advance of the battle, but the distribution of that food became heavily disrupted by the fighting. Likewise, 3 large ammunition depots had been stocked to the brim for the defending troops to use during the battle, but bizarrely they had been placed in the outer districts, making it quite likely they would be overrun by the incoming Red Army forces. As a backup, the military authorities did also establish emergency supply stations and depots at several U-Bahn stations. But again, the distribution of these supplies was a haphazard affair, with the Volkssturm units in particular being denied access to these supplies by the Wehrmacht, as it was presumed that the Volkssturm units, who had been established and sponsored by the Nazi Party, had surely been assigned their own provisions by party officials. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. Moreover, the SS, as usual, took care of themselves, and they built up impressive ammunition and supply storages for use by their own troops, which were jealously guarded and rarely offered to anyone else. Another important factor in Berlin's defense was its geography, and unfortunately for the Germans, the city possessed little in the way of natural defenses. On the one hand, Berlin was bordered by large lakes, including the Havel and Wannsee lakes to the west, and the Müggelsee lake to the east, which in theory could be utilized for defensive positions. Plus, Berlin itself was crisscrossed by a series of canals and rivers which could also help to frustrate the advance of the Red Army. On the other hand, the canals, rivers, and lakes of Berlin were hardly insurmountable natural barriers which couldn't be overcome, and at best they would provide a temporary headache to the Red Army. So with Berlin possessing such inadequate natural and man-made defenses, it was clear the only hope the city had of repelling the impending Soviet assault lay in the strength and fighting quality of its garrison forces. It's therefore time to look at the Berlin garrison forces charged with defending the city. Within Berlin itself, the city was split into 9 defense sectors, which ran from sectors A through to H, with the central Citadella district forming its own separate defense sector. A commander was assigned to each of these defensive sectors, but given the lack of qualified personnel and due to the fanaticism of the dying regime, which favoured loyalty over effective combat experience anyway, these defensive sector commanders were usually drawn from a list of party sycophants and die-hard SS men. The effectiveness of the defense in each sector depended solely on the competence and military experience of the commanders assigned to lead those sectors, as each commander was given free rein to conduct the defense of their sector as they saw fit. Moreover, the defense strategy for the varying sectors was not conducted in a unified strategic manner. Therefore, if one defense sector commander decided to hold their ground and fight to the last man, that was nice, but utterly useless if the neighbouring defense sector commander ordered all the men under his command to fall back. The fact that each defense sector commander was given such leeway to conduct the defense in their area as they saw fit is bizarre, especially when you do have an overall commander of the Berlin defense area, who we've already introduced as being General Reimann. To add to the chaos, General Reimann started the battle as the commander of the Berlin defense area, but he would actually be dismissed by Hitler midway through the battle and be replaced by General Weidling. The story behind Weidling's appointment will be covered in detail later in the series, but suffice to say the story behind Reimann's dismissal and Weidling's appointment is farcical, as General Weidling and his 56th Panzer Corps only found themselves in the city after they were pushed back by the Red Army's advance into Berlin itself. A further complicating factor of the Berlin Defense Command structure was caused by the presence and interference of the Nazi leadership. For instance, Goebbels was still Gauleiter of Berlin, so he was legally responsible for the city. By this stage of the war, Goebbels was wearing many hats, as he remained the Gauleiter of Berlin. He was also the commander of the Volkssturm in Berlin, whilst still being the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Unlike Hitler, who rarely left his bunker during the last months of the war, Goebbels was often seen in public, and he took his Gauleiter responsibilities seriously, making frequent trips to the front line to oversee the defences of Berlin. And he also chaired a weekly war council meeting every Monday in which the district commanders, the Berlin mayor, the president of the police, and senior representatives of the Luftwaffe, the Labour Service, the SS, and the main industries of Berlin were all present. Just as with his passion for propaganda, Goebbels threw himself into the task of preparing the defense of Berlin. But his grasp on the reality of the military situation facing Nazi Germany was still just as deluded and tenuous as ever. Moreover, his hands-on approach meant that he regularly interfered in all levels of the command structure, issuing a flurry of orders and counter-orders which inevitably frustrated the planning and execution of strategy on the battlefield. Also, despite in previous years allowing for some evacuations of Berliners in response to the incessant Allied air raids, Goebbels decided to take a different approach once it became clear that the Russians were about to march on Berlin. Because just as it became clear that Berlin would soon find itself on the front line, Goebbels suddenly refused to sanction the evacuation of the remaining population. It seems his refusal to evacuate the remaining civilians stemmed from his belief that this was alarmist and unnecessary. Plus, the lack of civilians might have disheartened the Berlin garrison troops. In any case, it seems Goebbels made little effort to ensure that there was enough medical supplies for the civilians in preparation for the fighting to come. Whatever Goebbels' capabilities as Gauleiter, the commander of the Berlin defense area was expected to report to him. Oh, and Hitler, of course, because, Hitler needs to manage everyone. So as you can see, the command structure for the defense of Berlin is multi-layered, messy, unorganized, and very contradictory. Brilliant. So now we've analysed the command structure, it's time to look at the German forces who formed the Berlin city garrison. When General Reimann was made commander of the Berlin defense area in early March 1945, he found that he had approximately 60,000 men assigned to the defense of Berlin, the overwhelming majority of which were Volkssturm men. The fact that the defense of the capital of the Third Reich was so wholly dependent on inexperienced and untrained Volkssturm men and boys is shocking by itself. But what's worse is that not even all of these Volkssturm men were supposed to even fight. That's because the Volkssturm units were divided into two categories. The first category, Volkssturm 1, had been given weapons and thus were expected to perform combat roles. Volkssturm 2, however, had no weapons at all, and thus they could only perform non-combat roles, such as transporting ammunition or helping to build barricades. Berlin did possess some experienced and well-trained troops, but these troops weren't used to man the defensive network throughout the city. No, in fact, they were being used for very specific duties, and their numbers were too small anyway. For instance, the mighty flak towers were operated by the well-equipped and disciplined Luftwaffe 1st Berlin Flak Division. The central Citadella district, meanwhile, containing the Reichstag and of course the Führer bunker, was defended by 1,200 men from the 1st SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Regiment, under the command of SS Brigadenführer und Generalmajor Wilhelm Mohnke. But apart from units such as these, in March and early April 1945, Berlin was seriously lacking any significant amounts of experienced fighting men. However, the real injection of frontline battle-hardened troops would only come at the start of the Battle of Berlin itself, when the German defences along the Seelow crumbled and numerous frontline Wehrmacht and SS units were pushed back into Berlin. Once these units entered the city limits, they were quickly absorbed into the Berlin garrison forces, providing a much-needed injection of seasoned, experienced troops. Better late than never. And of course, the last aspect of the Berlin garrison was to come from the emergency conscription of Hitler Youth Boys, Kriegsmarine auxiliaries, and police units, who were all forced to fight once the battle began in earnest. None of these units could be classed as qualified infantry, but in a desperate search for reinforcements to man Berlin's defences, it seems anyone would do. So they too were thrown into the front line, becoming little more than glorified cannon fodder. Given that the Berlin garrison composed of such varying and ad hoc units, it's tricky to get a concrete number of just how many garrison troops were defending Berlin when the Russians assaulted the city in late April. But General Weidling estimated that when he was appointed the new commander of the Berlin defense area on the 23rd of April, he had around 85,000 fighting men in total, which consisted of 45,000 Wehrmacht and SS troops, augmented by a further 40,000 members of the Volkssturm. The overwhelming bulk of the fighting men would be provided by Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps once it got pushed back into Berlin, and all of the units within this Panzer Corps would go on to play a vital role in the battle for the city. The units include the Panzer Division Müncheberg, the 18th and 20th Panzer Grenadier Divisions, the 9th Fallschirmjäger Division, and the 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland. Now obviously that last unit is quite wordy, so from now on I'll just refer to them as the Nordland Panzer Grenadier Division. The Berlin garrison forces were also severely lacking in armour, and when General Weidling became commander of Berlin halfway through the battle, he discovered that the city only had 60 tanks in total, most of which came from his own 56th Panzer Corps, which had only just arrived in Berlin. So as you can see from everything I've described, the Berlin garrison was a real smorgasbord of forces, who had wildly varying levels of strength, quality of equipment, and experience. Moreover, the diverse nature of the units meant that they had different command structures and supply depots, which only helped to exacerbate the difficulties the defenders faced. In addition, the way these garrison forces were positioned throughout the city also impacted how the battle unfolded. as the troops with the best fighting capability, highest motivation, and quality of equipment were tasked with defending the centre of the city, whilst the quality and number of troops ordered to defend the outskirts of the city was poor. This meant that when the Red Army finally reached Berlin, they would have a much easier time punching through the outer defences and outer districts of the city, before eventually facing stiffer resistance and more formidable defences the closer to the centre they got. But all of these various issues aside, the biggest problem facing the Berlin garrison was its size. Because if really there was only 85,000 fighting men in total defending Berlin during the battle, then that was a truly pitiful number given the fact that they were being tasked with defending the capital of the Third Reich from an attack by multiple fronts of the Red Army. General Raymond had estimated that he needed 10 fully fledged divisions to defend the outer defense ring alone, and that an extra 200,000 battle-hardened and seasoned veteran troops were needed to man the defences within the city. In reality, the Germans could only provide a fraction of that number, and what they could provide paled in comparison to the monstrous numbers of Red Army troops and tanks waiting to batter down the doors of Berlin. So just what forces had the Red Army assembled to capture Berlin? Before getting into the Soviet side of things, I just wanted to give a heads up that in the next section I will be recapping the Red Army forces and objectives which were outlined for Operation Berlin. I have given a broad overview of these forces and objectives before in my previous series on Halbe and Bautzen, so if you're a long-time listener and want to skip ahead for a few minutes, I won't hold it against you. In any case, once I've given this broad outline, I'll swiftly move on to detailing the specific armies involved in the direct assault on the capital itself. So by mid-April 1945, the Red Army had assembled 3 fronts along the banks of the Oder and Neisse rivers, in anticipation for the final assault on Nazi Germany, aka Operation Berlin. Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front was stationed at the Kustrin bridgehead approximately 70 kilometers east of Berlin, and his forces totaled 768,000 men. Zhukov's front was tasked with smashing through the German defences at the Zilower Heights, before then proceeding to attack Berlin itself from the north and the east. Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front, meanwhile, was stationed along the Neisse River to the south, along the border between Poland and the modern-day German states of Brandenburg and Saxony. Konyev's forces totaled more than 500,000 men, and his objective was to cross the River Neisse, advance into central Brandenburg, and secure the southern approaches to Berlin. And lastly, Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front, which totaled at least 315,000 men, was tasked with securing the northern approaches to Berlin. Each front possessed a terrifying amount of firepower, including thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, and planes. And the combined manpower of the 3 fronts, when you combine frontline forces and rear echelon troops, stood at close to 2.5 million men. The first objective of Operation Berlin was to encircle the capital and prevent any chance of German relief forces riding to Berlin's rescue from either the northern or southern approaches to the city. And the second objective of Operation Berlin was to capture the city itself, of course, and crush the Nazi regime once and for all. Stalin wanted Berlin to be captured as soon as possible, but at the very least, it had to happen by the 1st of May, to coincide with the most sacred of communist holidays, May Day. The planned start date for Operation Berlin was the 16th of April, when Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front were to launch their offensives, whilst Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front was to launch its offensive a few days later once its armies were in position. When reviewing the starting positions and the objectives given to the different fronts, it would seem that only Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front was being given the honour of directly attacking and capturing Berlin. But in actual fact, a combination of forces from both Zhukov and Konyev's fronts would be involved in the assault on the capital. This was due to the fact that at the start of Operation Berlin, Stalin drew a demarcation line between Zhukov and Konyev's forces, which ended at the central Brandenburg town of Lublin, roughly 65 kilometers southeast from Berlin. The choice of Lublin as the end point for the demarcation line was deliberate, as it offered Konyev the chance to swing his forces up northwards and participate in the attack on Berlin, provided he could reach Lublin fast enough. As it turned out, once Operation Berlin began on the 16th of April, Zhukov's forces would get stuck in intense fighting along the Zilower Heights until the 19th of April. Konyev's forces to the south, meanwhile, were able to easily smash through the German defences along the river Neisse, and they reached the town of Lublin within a day. When they reached Lublin, Konyev then won Stalin's approval to swing his forces northwards and join the attack on Berlin. Zhukov and Konyev, who were intense rivals, had been racing for months to capture Berlin, and once Zhukov's First Belarusian Front had been given the honour of attacking Berlin from the east, it had seemed as if Zhukov had beaten Konyev once and for all. But after the slow progress Zhukov's forces made at the Zilower Heights, Konyev had been given a second chance, and with his tank army striking towards the south of the capital, the race for Berlin was back on. With the First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts both assaulting Berlin at the same time, the rivalry which existed between its two commanders would filter down to all levels of command, and this would lead to deadly repercussions for the Soviet forces fighting on the ground. But that's a story for a different day. At this stage in our story, all we need to do is focus on which units from Zhukov's and Konyev's fronts were involved in the attack on Berlin. From Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, the main forces who assaulted Berlin were the 8th Guards Army, led by General Chukov. This army will play a crucial role in striking towards Berlin from the south and southeast. The 5th Shock Army would advance alongside the 8th Guards Army and fight in the eastern and southeastern districts of Berlin. And also fighting alongside the 8th Guards Army was the 1st Guards Tank Army. The 2nd Guards Tank Army, meanwhile, entered the northeastern suburbs of Berlin, but then was also involved in fighting in the northwest of the city. The main force involved in striking Berlin from the north was the 3rd Shock Army, and the 47th Army was involved in encircling the northern flank of Berlin, moving towards Oranienburg and Spandau. These weren't the only units from Zhukov's First Belarusian Front involved in the assault on Berlin, but I've given them a special mention as they will feature most prominently in our story. For Marshal Konyev's First Ukrainian Front, meanwhile, the most relevant units for our story are the 3rd Guards Tank Army, which will strike at Berlin from the south, and the 4th Guards Tank Army, which will strike at the southwest and west of Berlin, whilst also advancing towards Potsdam. Numbers-wise, Zhukov and Konyev's forces obviously suffered losses during their initial assaults on the Zilower Heights and the river Neisse. Yet by the time their respective fronts reached the gates of Berlin, they were still easily able to field more than 1 million men in their final assault on the city. Plus, unlike the Germans, the Red Army still enjoyed an embarrassment of riches when it came to tanks, guns, planes, and ammunition. All in all, the mismatch between the German defenders of Berlin and the Soviets was at least 10-1, both in terms of manpower and firepower. So, to conclude today's episode, we've looked at the desperate situation Berliners found themselves in as they prepared for the final Red Army assault on their city. We've analysed the German defence plans for Berlin, and we've outlined the Berlin garrison forces and the attacking Red Army forces who will battle it out for control of the capital. And so it's time for the Battle of Berlin to begin.